After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the concept of Gestalt approach to perception and identify different laws of perceptual organization. You shall also be able to explain law of similarity, continuity, closure, pragnanz, and proximity in this module.
After studying this module, you should be able to understand the Gestalt approach to perception, describe different laws of perceptual organization, and explain the law of similarity, proximity, pragnanz, closure, and continuity. Gestalt psychology was founded by German thinkers Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kafka. They mainly focused on how people interpret the world around them. The Gestalt perspective formed partially as a response to the structuralism of Wilhelm Wundt, who focused on breaking down mental events and experiences to the smallest elements. Structuralists had failed in explaining the concept of apparent motion and illusory contours. Gestalt psychologists further recognized that structuralism could not explain many perceptual phenomena. In response, they proposed that perception is based on the organization of stimuli into holistic and meaningful forms. They are well known for the phrase, "The whole is different than the sum of its parts." They proposed several laws, really heuristics or rules of thumb, that are referred to as the Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. These are discussed in this particular module later on.
Let's understand Gestalt approach to perception, what approach Gestalt was holding in explanation to what perception is all about. The most concise ways to characterize Gestalt psychology is to say that it deals with wholes, and its given data are what have been called the phenomenon. It is because of their strong phenomenological orientation which explains that wholes are expected or experienced by conscious mind than not in parts. For example, in perceiving a melody, one gets a melodic form rather than its strings or its note. So basically we focus on what the whole melody we are trying to hear, the music which is coming out, rather than focusing on the strings or the notes which have been played with that melody. So when you hear a song, the song or the music which is coming is to be heard in a continuous formation rather than in parts. This is how, or this is why you enjoy that music in a much better manner, or you have that experience of hearing a nice romantic melody or a peppy song, rather than to break it into parts. And if you would not enjoy that peppy song, or you will not enjoy that romantic song which you are hearing. So Gestalt was basically, he focused, when we take this example, in this example also the whole was focused more rather than its part. This is the way experience comes to man, organizing it into significant structured form. This is how you experience certain things. The feelings also are emerged through these experiences which you have gained when you were hearing a song. Maybe it's a romantic song, that the feeling of emotions were coming out because of this song only. Let's first understand the historical perspective from where its role started. While behaviorism was becoming the dominant psychological theory in the US, along with Freud's theory of psychoanalysis, the Gestalt perspective and influence in Europe around the world same time was also happening. Gestalt psychology was seen as an alternative to behaviorism and structuralism. As we had earlier said that it is basically it is taken from structuralism. What structuralism has left, Gestalt had started from that same point. The earlier psychologists or the early Gestalt thinkers felt that behaviorism dealt with too much with collecting, tallying and treating only specific problems or parts of a whole, as opposed to structuralist approach which focuses on particular elements in a configuration. The Gestalt approach focusing on the configuration itself. Gestalt is a German word meaning pattern, form or configuration. The term was introduced into physiological psychology by the German psychologist C. von Einfriels and was disseminated by K. Kafka. It was Kafka in 1935 who asked, why do things look as they do? This was a question which triggered the mind of many Gestalt psychologists, and further they started working on this area. In our daily life, our perception of several figures may share a common ground, and it may see that figures tend to cluster together in groups. So when you see a picture, it may be in the form of dots or any pattern. That pattern will be conceived, or that pattern would be emerged as an image when you club those dots together. Then only that image will be formed in front of you. So basically it's tallying with the pictures or the configurations which are there, dots which are there. You try and perceive it in a holistic manner, a picture which is being perceived. Kafka has identified ideas of perceptual organizations, and you can also see the image of K. Kafka out here. The questions which arises was that some elements of the perceptual field form the figures while others become ground, and why do figural elements group together the way they do. So some part of the picture would be as perceived as a ground, and some would be perceived as the group elements which are there. The conclusion arrived by him was that whatever is seen in this world corresponds to the perceptual Gestalten. It was held that perception, that we are aware of its configuration or structure, that is grasped as a whole and as not merely as some of its parts. This approach is also termed as Gestalt psychology. We will examine this approach in the next topic also. You can see with the figure whether some part of it is termed as a ground and some part of it is as a background, which you can see image in an image form, where two people are facing each other. This is an issue of deciding the figure, which is the front part, and the ground, which is the back part. So you are not able to decide which part of the figure is to be termed as the front and which image to be termed as a ground. So there is a confusion which is there, but people, it depends again on the holistic view of a person, whether they will perceive as a two faces facing each other, or they would see it as a kind of a vase which is there. Thus, the Gestalten choose to study perception in terms of inherent organization and configurational properties. That is, they termed it they organize it in such a manner that an image or a picture is formed out of it. The array of evidence suggests that events must be understood in terms of their holistic nature, as breaking them into elements destroys their essential meaning. If you just break down this image into parts as the upper portion, lower down, left, right, and then you try and perceive this picture, you will not understand it, or you will not try and hold any meaning out of that picture. It will not hold any meaning for you, because it is not forming some parts will not form a basic picture out of it. So you will not understand whether it's a vase or two people facing each other. For that, you need to understand the picture in a whole manner, or in a holistic manner, to figure out what is the background or what is the front portion out here. Gestalt concept is a further refinement of the notion of wholeness. It proved that initially in the perception theory, and was then applied generally to other concepts of psychology. So earlier it was limited to only Gestalt psychologists, but further on it transferred to other psychology fields also, where you were trying to understand the whole rather than understanding the parts out here. Now there is another topic which we should understand out here, is organization of perception. Gestalt psychology studies organization in the early part of the 20th century. When several sub-objects are present in the visual field, we tend to perceive them as organized into patterns or groupings. They assume that the whole is more than its sum of its parts. This explains that what is perceived has its own new properties that emerge from the organization that takes place. Organization in perception partially explains our perception of complex patterns as unitary form of or objects. We see objects as objects only because grouping processes operate in perception. So again we are referring to the same thing out here. Whole, when you organize an information, you organize it into whole form so that it's much easier for you to understand what kind of a picture you're perceiving. And this was further explained with the properties that emerge from organization, that grouping together, groups are formed to make one segment, another group is formed to another segment, so that when you perceive it, those groups come together and the second group come together to make a picture where a meaningful picture is formed. Our personal experiences are filled with groups and patterns of stimuli which are labeled as objects. The way the objects are perceived by people comes into our awareness or as shapes and patterns. Therefore, they tend to organize sensory inputs into perception of simple patterns or objects. The reason for this is that people do not perceive the world around them as patches of color, vision, variation in brightness or through sounds, but perception of objects are due to learning. So what you have learned that this is a box, so you will try and figure out what kind of a box it is, whether it's square, rectangle. So that is basically categorization of the shape, what color it has, what brightness it holds. So all these areas would be termed that you have learned, that this is a square, this is a circle, this is a rectangle. That information will help you in organizing that image or a picture as a whole. Then you are able to perceive, or then you are able to name it as okay, it's a square box, it's a rectangle box. Therefore, Gestalt psychologist has extensively studied the organizing tendencies in perception. They have given meaningful existence of such tendencies to strengthen their argument that the perceived world is not just the scene of simple sensory experiences. The principle that helps to understand or explain how objects are organized and perceived includes the following laws. According to Gestalt psychology, perception is about what happens to information as we process it, not just about the information itself. The information is important, but how you process or how you give meaning to that information, that is also very important out here. The law of proximity asserts that human will instinctively group the objects together. Expanding upon this further, we can see that the more basic and straightforward the objects, the easier and more uniformly most people will group that information in the similar manner. In the figure, we can also see, as you can see in the picture out here, that it is composed of certain circles and square shapes. The rows are alternatively placed in circles and squares. How this image will be perceived by you, it depends from individual to individual. As we have said, you probably will not see rows at all. Instead, you would probably see vertical columns of circles and squares, disregarding the presence of rows altogether. In this example, the groupings not only assist us in recognizing similarity, but actually shapes the way we perceive information. Gestalt psychology thus states that an end perception will be more than the sum of its parts, composing of that perception itself. For if the sum of the parts were the only factors influencing perception, in our example of law of proximity, we would either merely see a collection of circles and squares devoid of any type of groupings, or have no preference for columns or rows. So you had basically grouped all the similar objects, all the similar shapes together, and left the other group. You have made two groups out here, first of circles and the other of squares. This is how you have perceived the whole picture to be a square shaped, rather than turning out to be taking them into parallel forms. Another law we can understand, another law also out here which has been given by Gestalt, that law of good figure, which is also called as law of pragnanz. In law of pragnanz is sometimes referred to as the law of good figure also, or law of simplicity. The law holds that objects in the environment are seen in this way that makes them appear to simple as possible. This law says that we are innately driven to experience things in a good, in as good a gestalt as possible. Good can mean many things here, such as regular, orderly, simplicity, symmetry, and so on, which then refer to as specific gestalt laws. Something which is simpler, something which is easier for us to understand would be referred into this category. Maybe it's more of simpler shapes which are coming, more of simpler objects, squares, any shape, any symmetry which is there in a simpler form, it would be categorized into this law. For example, a set of dots outlining the shape of a star is likely to be perceived as a star, not as a set of dots. We tend to complete the figure, make it in a way it should be, finish it. Like we see, somehow manage to see this figure as to be B. So again, it depends from person to person how these dots are to be perceived, how these lines are being perceived by that person. Another example of law of pragnanz is shown out here, where this image image appears to be a series of circles rather than much as complicated shapes. You would perceive them to be not termed as a shape, but yes, that shape would be termed as Olympic sign or Olympic symbol. But initial phase would be of circles. There are 5 rings out here which you could perceive it to be on the first phase. Next law is law of proximity. The principle of proximity states that all else being equal, perception does tends to group stimuli that are close together as parts of same objects and stimuli that are far apart as to separate objects. This allows for the grouping together of elements into larger sets and reduces the need to process a larger number of smaller stimuli. Take constellations for example. When we look at the night sky, we look for the stars that are close together, close to one another, and try to find out or try to find some sort of meaning out of those stars. Based on their proximity to one another, we have clustered groups of stars together and specify them with names and shapes such as the Big Dipper or Orion's belt. We have essentially created meaning out of randomness. Let's look at the image which is there of circles below. On the left side, it appears that the circles are haphazardly placed in no particular order. On the right side, even though the same circles are used, it is clear to us that the shape of a triangle has been formed. Our minds have found a unity amongst the shapes based on the proximity to one another. For this reason, people tend to cluster the dots on a page instead of a large number of individual dots. The brain groups together the elements instead of processing a large number of similar or smaller stimuli, allowing us to understand and conceptualize information more quickly. Law of continuity. This law states that there is a tendency to group together stimulus elements that are a part of a continuous sequence. This principle of organization presumes that there is a tendency to perceive a line as a continuation line or as an established direction. That is, we tend to continue contours. We tend to continue contours when we perceive them to be heading in an implied direction. When two lines of objects intersect, the continuation of each of the line is apparent out here. All elements are perceived as part of a coherent object. So, for example, if the dots are arranged in a line, they would be considered more related than detached elements. In the image that the line created from circles on the left continues, vice versa, the other one is interrupted. Therefore, this allows us to see the image as flowing smoothly without breaking, lines up into multiple parts. So the direction and implied direction is being seen out here with the circles or the dots on in the image. The next law is law of closure. The basic Gestalt principles such as collinear and proximity give rise to more complex construct known as closures, which allows the representation of a unified border around the object surface. According to this law, objects that are grouped together are seen to be as whole. We tend to ignore gaps and complete contour lines that may be essential for shape representation. But the closures, the lines which are there will be perceived as a whole out here. Law of closures therefore states that we perceive objects such as shapes, letters, pictures, etc. as whole even if they are incomplete. Our perception fills that gap which is there, incomplete gap which is there with these images, and form a perfect image out of it. Our perception fills in the missing parts of the picture even when pieces are missing. For example, when we see a triangle which really does not appear to be, but it is being perceived with the missing half triangle which is there and the circle which is being cut half circle out of there. We ignore the gaps which is there and complete the contour lines which are being formed out of that missing gaps. In this image, we are able to see no triangles or circles, but our mind fills in the missing information to create familiar shapes and images. In the second example also we can see that there are no triangles or circles, but our mind fills in the missing information to create a familiar shape out of it, or the image of a circle and a square, which is not a complete portion, but still our mind processes that information, it fills up that gap, and you try and perceive it as a whole, which would be maybe a triangle, a circle, or a square. Therefore, Gestalt have emphasized the factor in pointing to perceptual organization. The human mind has a tendency to complete whatever is incomplete because a symmetrical form is more satisfying than a non-symmetrical form. So let's try and summarize till now what we have understood. Gestalt psychology emerged in the 20th century in response to structuralism, as they believe that perception is built up from simple sensations and fail to explain apparent motions. Gestalt principles are sometimes called heuristics also. These provide best guesses about the stimulus objects. Gestalts have emphasized that the human mind perceives the object as a whole and complete the images which are incomplete ones or in incomplete form. Law of proximity. This law states that items which are close together in space or time tend to be perceived as belonging together or forming an organized group. Law of similarity. The law of similarity suggests that similar things tend to appear together or when they are grouped together. Law of continuity holds that point that are connected by straight or curving lines are seen to be seen in a way that follows the smoothest path rather than seeing them separate lines and angles. Last but not the least, law of closure. According to law of closure, things are grouped together if they are seen to be complete entity. Our brains often ignore contradictory informations and fill in the gaps in information which are required out here. Law of pragnanz is sometimes referred to as law of good figure or law of simplicity. This law holds that objects in the environment are seen in a way that makes them appear as simple as possible.
Let's first understand the historical perspective from where Gestalt role started. While behaviorism was becoming the dominant psychological theory in the US, along with Freud's theory of psychoanalysis, which were being opposed for various reasons by different schools of psychology. It was then that the Gestalt perspective gained influence in Europe around the same time. Gestalt psychology was seen as an alternative to behaviorism and structuralism. The early Gestalt thinkers, Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, and Wolfgang Kohler, felt that behaviorism dealt too much with collecting, tallying, and treating only specific problems or parts of a whole. As opposed to the structuralist approach, which focuses on particular elements in a configuration, the Gestalt approach focuses on the configuration itself and maintained interest in studying the mind. This was the time when Gestalt psychology started to emerge as a strong influence. In 1910, Max Wertheimer, on vacation, noticed that distant objects seemed to move with the train, nearby objects went past. Then study of apparent motion, why stationary objects appear to move with the started train. This further led to the study of apparent motion with his two former students, Kafka and Kohler. The most concise way to characterize Gestalt psychology is to say that it deals with wholes and its given data are what have been called phenomena. It is because of their strong phenomenological orientation which explains that wholes are experienced by conscious mind and not in parts. Humans are not passive receivers of sensory information. Our perceptions are active, lively, and organized. For example, in perceiving a melody, one gets a melodic form, not a string or a note, a unitary whole. That is something more important than the total list of its parts. This is the way experience comes to man, organizing it into significant structured form. Thus, the Gestaltists choose to study perception in terms of inherent organization and configurational properties. Gestalt team consisted of three most prominent members, namely Wertheimer, who studied law but became interested in the perception he experienced on a train. He published his seminal paper titled Experimental Studies of the Perception of Movement in 1912. Kafka, the writer and theorist, produced the basic principles of Gestalt psychology in 1935. He asked, why do things look as they do? Kohler participated with Wertheimer and Kafka in research to launch Gestalt psychology. He was a debater and enjoyed debating and criticizing the behaviorists and structuralists. All of them have contributed in development of Gestalt psychology in some way or the other. Gestalt is the German word meaning pattern, form, or configuration. The term was introduced into physiological psychology by the German psychologist Stefan Ehrenfels and was disseminated by Kafka. Kohler's criticism of behaviorism and structuralism further led the path of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologist has extensively studied the organizing tendencies in perception. They have given meaningful existence of such tendencies to strengthen the argument that the perceived world is not just the scene of simple sensory experiences. The principle that helps to explain how objects are organized and perceived includes the following: law of similarity, law of pragnanz, law of proximity, law of continuity, and law of closure. Let us understand the first law of perceptual organization, namely law of similarity. The law of similarity asserts that humans will instinctively group similar objects together. Objects that have similar visual characteristics, such as size, shape, or color, will be seen as a group and therefore related. Expanding upon this further, in this example, you may not see any rows at all. Instead, you would probably see vertical columns of circles and squares, disregarding the presence of rows. In this example, what do you see? You tend to group together the similar objects, that is, the dark blue colors, to perceive a number 5. This is a clear example of law of similarity. The law of pragnanz is sometimes referred to as the law of good figure or the law of simplicity. The law holds that objects in the environment are seen in a way that makes them appear as simple as possible. This law says that we are innately driven to experience things in as good a gestalt as possible. Good can mean many things here, such as regular, orderly, simplicity, symmetry, and so on, which then refer to specific Gestalt laws. The following images are examples of law of pragnanz. In this figure, you will see the letter B instead of dotted lines. The next principle is the law of proximity, which states that all else being equal, perception tends to group stimuli that are close together as part of the same object and stimuli that are far apart as two separate objects. This allows for the grouping together of elements into larger sets and reduces the need to process a larger number of smaller stimuli. In this example, the dots put nearer will be perceived as a triangle. This is an example of law of proximity. Law of continuity states that there is a tendency to group together stimulus elements that are a part of a continuous sequence. This principle of organization presumes that there is a tendency to perceive a line as a continuation of its established direction. This can clearly be seen in the image above. We tend to see these dots as a continuous line. According to the law of closure, we perceive objects such as shapes, letters, pictures, etc. as wholes even when they are incomplete. We tend to ignore gaps and complete contour lines that may be essential for shape representation. Our perception thus fills in the missing parts of the picture even when pieces are missing to form an image as a whole. In this image, there are no triangles or circles, but our mind fills in the missing information to create familiar shapes and images. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. It all started in the 20th century when Gestalt psychology started to be recognized in response to structuralism, as structuralism could not explain many perceptual phenomena. Gestalt term was introduced by Ehrenfels and was disseminated by Kafka. Gestalt psychology has a well-known phrase, "the whole is different than the sum of parts." Gestaltists proposed several laws that are referred to as the Gestalt law of perceptual organization.